Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Conversations in Moral Theology, a program sponsored by New Wine, New Wineskins, a national association for early career Catholic moral theologians. I'm Alessandro Rovari, and today I'm joined by Charles C. Camosy, who is Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University. We are here to talk about his latest book, Losing Our Dignity: How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality, which he published this year with New City Press. Hello, Charlie. Thank you for joining us. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Yes, it is a pleasure. It was more of a pleasure to see you physically in South Bend, but it's good to see you virtually here as well.
Thank you. So let me start by asking you, what is the vision behind this book? Why did you write it, and what is the heart of what you wanted to communicate to your readers?
So I guess it combines two things that are very much at the heart of who I am as a theologian, as a bioethicist, as a Catholic. Um, One is, you know, human dignity, human equality. That's the fundamental equality of all, radical equality of all, is why I got into doing moral theology at all. I wanted to do my part, both in the academy and in the public square, to draw attention to those who were not part of the circle of protection that fundamental human equality provides. But as a bioethicist for the last, 15, 16 years, I guess, um, I've seen such a change in the field of bioethics and in healthcare more broadly, such that we've went to a kind of, things are complicated. There are people that are open to theological ideas like being like Imago Dei, and there are people that are open to theologians and people with religious beliefs being at the heart of those conversations, to real hostility, irreligious um, hatred in some ways, for um, people offering those kinds of perspectives. And when you combine, um, my first set of insights, and or not insights, like the reason for my vocation, with this kind of hostility, and you kind of do the math and say, well, when you lose this theological basis for fundamental human equality, especially in the context of medicine, where it's so acute, what's been happening? And so I felt like I wanted to write it all down, tell the story of how this has happened, and especially, and I'll finish this overly long answer with this point. Especially with kind of the new places that this trajectory seems to be going, which in the book I argue is in the direction of marginalizing those with Alzheimer's disease and other kinds of dementia. Um, so I feel like that's the kind of next step. We're kind of in the middle of taking it. Maybe is it fair to say it's maybe not the next step? We're kind of taking that step right now. And so I also wanted to write a book that sounded the alarm on that.
Thank you. So you mentioned how you noticed this change from conversations across ethicists to approach questions from different perspectives to a hostility, you named it, against any religious bearing on these questions. In the book, I think one of the very helpful things you do is to outline such history, naming some names and some pivotal moments. Would you reflect a little bit of some of the pivotal figures and moments of this history?
Yeah, so I take it from several places, but maybe my main source is Dan Callahan's book In Search of the Good, where he kind of reflects on his whole career. It's almost like a memoir, but his whole career in bioethics. And uh, I mean, from a certain perspective, and this makes the shifts really dramatic. From a certain perspective, bioethics as a subdiscipline of moral theology was the first theologians were the first bioethicists. So, um, but even if we did not, even if one were to deny that, which is not historically accurate, and say, well, bioethics kind of began with the Hastings Center and you know Dan and Sidney Callahan and company. There was at the beginning a real mix of folks, right? A real mix of people who are theologians, philosophers, clinicians, and more. But as Dan tells the story, um, there became an increasing level of hostility, such that the philosophers over time would basically be like, we don't think the theologians belong here, essentially. And and as this unfolded, I mean, I don't need to tell you, there's almost no presence, theological presence at the Hastings Center anymore. There's almost no theological presence um, in a serious way at ASBH, the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, anymore. In fact, if you submit a proposal to the ASBH's annual meeting and it has explicit theological content in it, the chances of being accepted are almost zero. I mean, I haven't done a study on this or anything, but I'm in these circles enough to know. I myself submitted a proposal based on this book I just wrote and had it rejected. So the and that this is what other theologians report, and the major journals themselves. The American Journal of Bioethics, for instance, ran a Target article, a major article that I responded to a few years ago by Timothy Murphy, arguing for irreligion, hostility to religion in bioethics. They decided to make that a Target article. Um, so there are pockets. There is an interest group at ASBH that's Christian theology. There are places like the Journal of Christian Bioethics, and the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy still publishes some religiously sounding stuff. But in the main and in the halls of power, um, when it comes to the discipline of bioethics, there's been a very, very strong marginalization, and frankly, a hostility that undergirds that marginalization.
Thank you. Well, I would assume that some of the folks who you think are hostile to religion would respond to this line of questioning by saying things like, well, it's not so much that we are against religion, we just need to protect the space of medicine, of public reasoning from thick moral commitments that have a religious foundation, so that we give space to all sorts of commitments, and we do not impose on a religious basis commitments that do not belong to everybody anymore. How would you respond to this kind of critique of your critique?
Yeah, so I mean, just to give the devil his due, as it were, there is a problem with thick moral commitments from people with very different points of view because it's tough to get it going. I mean, this is one of the problems that moral theologians are, who at least know anything about moral theology and ethics, are very well aware of. The thicker the commitments, the more specific the commitments, the more difficult exchange and dialogue becomes. And so, in some ways, this impulse does come out of I don't know about a good place, but it's certainly an understandable place, right? A place that says we need a kind of thinning of the discourse, a least common denominating of the discourse, uh, to have a discussion about brain death or about what our healthcare system should look like, or about if there's a different, talking about whether there's a difference between killing or letting die, or what constitutes, an acceptable level of basic care that would be covered as a fundamental right or something like that. It'd be much easier. It is much easier to have those conversations when it's not a pitched battle between positions that are really thick and quite different from each other. But that, of course, is not something that is limited to religious versus non-religious positions. I mean, if somebody comes in as a Kantian into these discussions and somebody else comes in as a utilitarian and both are non-theists, it's just as problematic a discussion, maybe even more problematic discussion, to have, let justice be done though the heavens fall versus maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number versus quality adjusted life years. I mean, that's such a well-known and well-trodden, but nevertheless deeply, deeply problematic level of contestation. That to say that, if we let religious people in, there's somehow going to be this special level of difficulty because of thick moral principles that are, make it difficult for us to converse, just makes no sense. In fact, in some ways, if you have a kind of Kantian religious person and a Kantian more secular person, they would have much more to say to each other, perhaps, than a secular Kantian versus a secular utilitarian. What I actually think is going on here, and we talked about this at the New Wineskins conference, but for most of my career, I've been very hesitant to talk about, secret motivations and like bad argument and bad faith, because I think it really does poison the discourse, and it's hard to have dialogue if you start there. But over the years, I've just seen so much of it that I felt like it's just impossible to really be authentic and honest about what's happening if you don't name it and call it out. I really don't think what's going on here is really about that. It's really about an attempt to marginalize players in the debate with views that people don't like. So if, for instance, I've written about this before, and I've given talks on this before. It's not that there's an utter hostility to anything religious in these debates. If Pope Francis says that, we ought to have universal health care as a human right, and a theologian brings that into the bioethics debate, there is no one at the American Journal of Bioethics or the Association of Bioethics and Humanities meetings that will say, get that theological stuff out of here. This doesn't belong. It's a thick vision of the good, which is going to muck up our ability to have good conversations. No, that's totally welcomed as, a friendly player in the discussions. When there's less friendly players in the discussions, including those that want to say, to get to one of the points of my book, that there's whole populations of human beings that are being discarded or ignored or violently killed here, and we ought to pay attention to those. Then those are often unwelcome positions, and suddenly then we have a reference to people who hold those views being religious and not welcome in the conversations. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So one listening to the conversation might think, well, what's up with all this complaining about the fact that the religious voice does not find enough space? Why should we care about that? In the book, you describe how there are actually consequences for the vulnerable populations that medicine is supposed to serve when that theological voice is absent or even ostracized from the discourse. So it's not just a claim that we theological ethicists want to have a space in the conversation, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamental. If we can't find a base, the shift we've made from an moral anthropology, which is grounded in human beings sharing a common nature, which reflects the image and likeness of God, to human beings that may or may not have actualized capacities like rationality, self-awareness, autonomy, productivity, and the like. That shift, which not accidentally has come as theological voices have become more and more marginalized from the discussion, is what has produced, quite rightly, if you understand that shift as a good thing, right, or as the correct thing, whole human populations is being discarded, not one of us. And whether they're prenatal populations, so-called brain dead populations, so-called vegetative populations. More and more toddlers with unexplained neurodegenerative diseases might fall into this category. Those with later stage dementia who've lost their rationality, self-awareness, autonomy, productivity, etc. I mean, this is as fundamental as it gets. This is why the subtitle is Fundamental Human Equality, and not, what we think follows from that equality, which are really important conversations, was the subject of my dissertation and first book. But this gets it just to the fundamental metaphysical questions about who should count as one of us, and who should not, and what should not. And medicine, because it's so intimately connected to practices that are just right at the heart of these, where these questions matter the most, right? Like abortion, like end of life issues, like the ICU, like care homes, and other places that take care of our elderly. Um, these are fundamental. The secularization of this is not some like right wing hysterical special pleading complaint. This is at the heart of what I led our discussion with. Like, what do we mean? What is it to say that someone is one of us, and if they're not recognized as such, how should we react? So the theology's place is at the heart of that major problem, and fundamental problem.
Thank you. So when a person opens the book and looks at the table of contents, she can find a list of biomedical issues that are pretty familiar to anybody who is versed in the discourse. What's striking, though, again, just looking at the contents, is that these medical issues are not treated in the abstract, but they're always accompanied by a name. There is an interweaving of stories and issues that is at the heart of the book. Can you talk about this choice that you have made? Because I find it very interesting and fruitful.
Well, thank you. Well, as I talked about at our new wineskins meeting this summer, I come out of an analytic philosophy background where there's still a part of me that wants to make it still all about the arguments, and all about reasoning well, and offering evidence, and being extremely careful and rigorous. And frankly, I think that's still very, very important. But over the years, I've been convinced that, especially if you want to an interest, make a difference outside of the academy, and even in the academy, frankly, because not all parts of the academy are equally committed to making good arguments and marshaling evidence. Telling stories is about the most powerful thing you can do. Now, I do think there is a danger to that, which is one reason I was against it. Not against it, but suspicious of those that talked about story all the time in the early part of my career. Because story, you could just cherry pick stories that fit your own point of view, and this happens all the time now, especially with how easy it is to tell a story online, or at least a very quick story, quick video, quick anecdote. Which is why in the book I really do connect the stories to hopefully readers think serious, rigorous argument and evidence. But I want to not make it an abstract thing. So, for instance, when I talk about the chapter on brain death, which I think brain death, marshaling the best arguments and evidence is the turning point here. It's the point where we first said there is this living member of the human family there, Homo sapiens, there, and they don't count the same as us. Their body is fighting off infections. They may be pregnant and gestating a child. In the case in the story I tell, that of Jahai McMath, after the state of California had declared her brain dead, she got her first period. She reached adolescence while she was supposedly dead. These are not the actions of a dead human being. But we have said that they're dead, and for reasons that, again, maybe aren't totally authentic or honest. The story of Jahai McMath is powerful all by itself, but it's connected to a historical fact that the reason why we originally said that people like her were dead was to get more organs. And I'm an organ donor. I'm very supportive of vital organ donation. But the reason why we originally said that people like her were dead was because we needed access to more organs. At least that's what the Harvard Brain Death Commission said, and that's what the secularized medical community said, and even parts of, let's face it, the religious community as well has said since then. But the story of Jahai McMath, at least from my perspective, is so powerful that when you combine that story with rigorous argument and marshaling of evidence, it becomes a powerful combination for rethinking something which needs a powerful rebuttal, because something like brain death is just so, quote unquote, settled law in all around the Western world, in fact. Except, interestingly, and here I'll finish this another very long answer with this final point. Except with many Orthodox Jews. So one of the reasons that Jahai McMath, and this is part of the story I tell, was able to be cared for by her family, who wanted to care for her, African American family, by the way, that had very deep religious beliefs as well, was because Orthodox Jews had fought so-called brain death in New Jersey and New York, and they carved out religious exemptions for themselves in the law here in New Jersey, where I live, in the state of New York, where I work. And so there was a place actually for Jahai's mother to take her, to care for her, precisely because this religious group had decided, hey, you know what? It turns out somebody that can gestate a child, that can have their first period, that can fight off disease, whose heart rate increases and adrenaline kicks in when they're cut. These are fellow human beings that are profoundly damaged, and we ought to treat them as such. So hopefully, the combination of telling a personal story like that, which is, in my view, again, so powerful, combined with, again, looking at history, looking at the arguments and evidence, can give somebody who's skeptical at least a fighting chance of being self-critical and actually hearing what I have to say.
Thank you. So let's talk a bit about brain death and the way you problematize it in the book. First of all, I'd like to ask you: there are some magisterial documents that do talk about brain death, and so I'd be interested in your reflection on how your problematization of brain death fits with this magisterial tradition, limited but still present.
Yeah. So again, if you know history, there's all sorts of things that the magisterium has pronounced on in certain ways that had a certain biological understanding associated with them. One of the things that or at least my opponents on abortion who are theologically minded like to talk about is the fact, or sometimes like to talk about, is the fact that it wasn't always the case that the church said a prenatal child, especially in the early stages of her life, mattered the same as a newborn or the rest of us. But that came out of a really, really fundamentally mistaken understanding of prenatal biology. And once we had the correct understanding, a more full understanding of prenatal biology, the church rightly shifted to incorporate the latest science, the latest evidence on this into its point of view. Initially, there was some hesitation, even when it came to organ donation on the part of the magisterial church. Now it's, in my view, rightly praised as being largely a very positive thing, much less, constituting mutilation or something like that. So I guess that's the context in which I think about this. I am a son of the church. I am not dissenting from any principle here. I'm merely saying Uh, the biology that we've come to understand in these contexts is worthy of note here. You know, again, once we learn new things, we're free to about science. We're free to reevaluate the kind of theological and moral theological judgments we've made in the past. And as we learn more about so-called brain death, and as we reflect more, I think, on the history of where this has come from, uh, it merits more and more skepticism. Just let me say something also about Jahai McMath. I
Mhm.
mean, even if one were to say, Charlie, you're wrong here, we just need to do a better job of diagnosing brain death, you know? So the cases you're talking about, like Jahai McMath and some others, are poor examples because maybe they were diagnosed wrongly. I'm willing, certainly, to entertain that argument. But in the case of Jahai McMath, the head of pediatrics at the hospital she was at, according to her family anyway, pounded the desk and said, "She's dead, dead, dead. What do you not understand about this?" Um, the public bioethics community and even the academic bioethics community reacted to her case with a similar kind of, extreme confidence. I mean, Art Kaplan, who is maybe the most prominent bioethicist in the United States, maybe the world, said she's a corpse and her body is going to start decomposing. Treating her amounts to desecration of a body. Um, she lived 5 more years and was cared for. And there's video which apparently, I mean, there's debate about what it shows, but apparently shows her responding to commands from her mother. So actually, there was a peer-reviewed journal in neurology which came out with an article recently after my book was published, of course, um, which had somebody say, you know what, we were wrong about Jahai McMath. She did not have she did not meet the criteria for brain death. She had something called responsive unawake syndrome. He invented a neologism to refer to what she had. Responsive unawake syndrome. Now, what do we do with all that? I mean, I guess one thing we could say is, Charlie, you go too far here. We still need to keep the concept of brain death in some way, but we need to be more judicious about when we apply it. But when you have the bioethics community and the clinical community, sometimes literally or and other times metaphorically, pounding the table, saying, "Those of you who don't understand that Jahai McMath is dead are idiots," um, then there's a serious problem that needs to be addressed one way or the other.
Thank you. And the other very productive discussion that you at least hint at in the book in connection to brain death is discussion about consciousness and how we should understand it. You point out how often we equate brain and consciousness, but again, you want to problematize this assumption. And while this is not at the very center of the book, in a number of cases, you point to the need to rethink and explore more the issue of consciousness. What is consciousness?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting to think. I mean, it may be too simple to say this is yet another problem of the Enlightenment and imagining ourselves as, thinking things or something rather than embodied creatures. But there is something, isn't there, to wonder about, to think about, um, to ponder about, like, why is it that we're so insistent that consciousness must be in the brain, whatever that means, or like of the brain? Um, the ancient Egyptians who presumably had, I mean, we don't know what it's like to be an ancient Egyptian, but they, at least those that were mummifying um, bodies after they died, didn't think the brain was important at all. They threw it out. Apparently, and I'm not a historian of this era, but apparently historians of this era say that ancient Egyptians thought the brain cooled the blood or something like that. It wouldn't be important enough to keep for the afterlife. No, so I like to think about that. Like, what kind of cultural, um, like, what kind of cultural view of their own bodies did they have? Like, I think we kind of in the West imagine ourselves kind of existing in our heads, like we are our heads, or if we could find a way to cut off our heads and put it in a vat of protein or something, that we would still be existing, or somehow that's why there's all these head transplant thought experiments. But obviously the ancient Egyptians had a very different idea about where they kind of located themselves or thought of their identity residing. It wasn't in the brain, otherwise they wouldn't throw it away. But why am I even talking about this? Well, we haven't been able to find consciousness in the brain, despite the best efforts of neurobiologists and other researchers, and sometimes neurobiologists and people trained in neurobiology and philosophy of mind have been looking to this for many years, decades, even to the point where philosophers like Daniel Dennett will say, consciousness is an illusion because we can't find it in the brain. Um, if, and I'm not an expert on these, there are many, many more expert people uh, in theology who know more about this than I do. But if we take seriously a kind of hylomorphic view of the soul, where the soul is the form of the body and interwoven with the body, maybe in a kind of Thomistic Aristotelian sense, and we combine it with where consciousness studies seems to be going, like people like Alvin Noe and others seem to be thinking of consciousness as a kind of product of the whole person in his or her environment. There just seems to be um, interesting work to be done, especially in light of what we know about brain death and, importantly, so-called persistent or permanent vegetative state. So that's another chapter I have where I get into this. Joe Finns over at NYU wrote this amazing book called Rights Come to Mind, where he articulates some of his own research and the research of others, which shows that the brain is actually much more plastic and regenerative than we thought, that consciousness can be discovered or coaxed in people with brains that are almost totally destroyed. So there's just real fertile ground here. It seems to be the problem of consciousness. The people who are working on consciousness think of it as a fundamentally embodied thing, not just located in the brain. And then those of us that have a kind of Thomistic Aristotelian view of the soul as being the form of the body, and if the soul is connected to consciousness in this way, there just seems to be, especially with what we're learning again about so-called brain death and so-called vegetative state, and there just seems to be a lot of interesting places to go when it comes to these questions that would lead to some fruitful research.
Thank you. And this is also connected to another ongoing reflection in the book, namely the problematization of any trait X view of humanity. So we are human beings as long as we are XYZ. Um, it strikes me how, when reading these arguments, I always discover myself very much shaped by this trait X view myself, despite my theological commitments. Uh, it somehow has a profound grasp on our imagination. And in the book, you articulate that that's the case because there are powerful forces at work in society, in culture, to make us think of ourselves and others according to these criteria. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of those forces, maybe the primary one, is global capitalism, right? So in consumerism, it's cousin. So um, if you're thinking about who matters in those contexts, it's going to be people who have certain kinds of actualized traits so that they can produce capital, right, and not drain it. So um, those who are productive, obviously, those who are rational and self-aware, make choices within the marketplace, autonomous enough to make choices in the marketplace, and also autonomous enough not to be a net drain on resources rather than a net creator of resources. And so I don't think it's an accident at all, frankly, that rather than some other traits X's, we've settled on these as being absolutely central to who we think matters. I mean, and frankly, and that this is a theme running throughout the book. One of the major catalysts for people losing, human beings losing their dignity, and it's attributed dignity. Of course, no one loses their metaphysical dignity as a creature of God, in the image and likeness of God. Um, that's also come about sometimes very explicitly as a result of lack of resources or questions about resources or how much individuals might cost. And again, this was a major focus of my first book and my dissertation. But um, it again, the Harvard Brain Death Commission was concerned about allocation of a scarce resource, organs, vital organs. When Joe Fins is talking about whether what he calls therapeutic nihilism can ever be combated enough to consider those with so-called in a so-called vegetative state will ever get the care that he thinks they deserve, and he calls it a fundamental civil rights question of fundamental civil rights for so-called vegetative patients. It's a question of resources. He's aware of it. Like, who's going to put in the necessary resources to care for a patient, to give therapies to a patient who's been marginalized this way. Though it wasn't explicitly stated, I really do believe, and I make some cases for this in the book, that Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans, it's no accident that those questions arose in the context of a national health service, which focuses on quality adjusted life years at the basis of what they do. So, what is the quality being adjusted? How is the quality of life being adjusted? Well, I mean, it's on one hand a silly question because who knows how that even works. But implicitly, at least, in the context of global capitalism, consumerism, one's quality of life goes down insofar as they become more of a drain on society versus a builder of capital. And we see this especially, I mean, we see it quite clearly when it comes to Down syndrome, which is explicitly related to how we think about abortion, where so many prenatal children are killed via abortion simply because they have Down syndrome, even though people with Down syndrome report being happier than those of us without Down syndrome. The culture itself makes a judgment about what kind of lives are worth living and which are not, coming back to these kinds of categories. So yeah, it's the trait X's that are chosen reveal quite a bit about like what's actually running the show, it seems to me.
Thank you. So you mentioned abortion. Obviously, this is at the arguments about abortion are at the heart of all biomedical discussions, and in many ways, the ways in which people think about other issues are somehow related to how they think about abortion. And so, I want to talk a little bit about that. In particular, I think that the one thing that makes your contribution especially valuable is this sense of the equal dignity of women who are vulnerable people and prenatal children. And in the book, and also in your broader scholarship and public advocacy, you really emphasize the unity, invulnerability of women and prenatal children. Can you talk about that, please?
One of the things that, again, um, the opponents of pro-lifers often rightly point out is that women were for most of human history, in fact, were part of these human populations that were not part of the circle of equality. And that is something we need to own. That is something we need to understand is still with us in some ways in the current culture. But it doesn't always play out the way that we might think. So it doesn't appear, for instance, that abortion actually helps us honor the equal dignity of women in any significant way. In fact, what, especially in the context of consumerism and global capitalism, it's forced many women to have abortions they don't want to have in order to quote unquote be equal. one of my favorite groups are pro-life feminists, and pro-life feminists have said for a long time that abortion is just kind of oppression redistributed. So if you're thinking that abortion is important for the full and equal dignity of women, you've lost the plot, as it were, because you're just redistributing a kind of marginalization, a kind of violence that ought not to be redistributed to this other vulnerable population. Now, pregnancy itself is, of course, a unique relationship where, if we're talking about two equals, it's unlike any other kind of relationship around. It's unbelievably intimate. It's profoundly interpersonal in a way that no other interpersonal relationship really is. I mean, it's even at a cellular level. We now know that the cells of the mother stay in the child her whole entire life, and vice versa. That the cells of the cells of the child stay in the mother her entire life. There's even some evidence to show, and more work needs to be done about this, that the cells migrate to places where there might be some damage, even like again, we need more work on this, but there's some preliminary indications that perhaps the cells even perform like a helpful therapeutic function in some way. But my frustration, I mean, I have many frustrations with the abortion wars, but one of them is that we always, or many of us who take a very hard position one way or the other on this question, often abstract one member of this dyad, if you will. Pregnancy is just again an unbelievably intimate relationship. So if we just show a picture of the prenatal child without her connection to the mother, which might be appropriate in some ways, we're trying to learn about biology or whatever. But if that translates into a public policy or a theology or a way of being in the world that constantly abstracts, like we don't think about the relationship and just think about prenatal children without thinking about their mothers, then something has gone terribly wrong. By the same token, if we only think about the mother and we don't think about prenatal justice, which unfortunately is where most of the academy it seems to be, including, I would say, to our shame, a lot of the Catholic Academy, something else has gone terribly wrong there as well. Throwaway culture works in both ways. In some cases, women and mothers are discarded as so much trash as populations we don't need to think about. In many, many, many other cases, the prenatal child is discarded as so much trash, not made worthy to think about. And we need to think about justice for both populations.
Thank you. So, obviously, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the book has many reasons. It talks about many things, but certainly it emerges from your prose and also from your public scholarship that you think that there is an emergency, an urgency when it comes to elderly people with late stage dementia. Why do you see such an urgency, and how do you think about this ensuing issue?
Well, in some ways, it's an attempt to make up for something I totally whiffed on my 2019 book, Resisting Throwaway Culture. I should have had a chapter on the elderly, and especially elderly with dementia. I talk about it a few times, these issues a few times, but it really deserved its own chapter and focus then. But like many of us, I guess, I was awoken to this problem during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, when it was just so clear to us that the elderly who we've warehoused in houses of death, I think it's fair to say, were so horribly treated and suffered so much misery and death, during the early stages and even now of the pandemic. But like many of us, I guess it was an occasion to think about this structure that, at least in the United States, we've created for ourselves, where we again warehouse our elderly and outsource their care to often poorly paid individuals who are understaffed and overworked, um, and and create lives of desperate mortal loneliness. Um, if we're talking about a culture of encounter and hospitality, which I argued in Resisting Throwaway Culture is the antidote to throwaway culture, this is whatever that is. This is the opposite of that. And when I looked more into it, I discovered that the number of people with late stage dementia is going to double over the next 2 decades. We already basically don't treat this population as our equals, which is why early on I said we're kind of taking in the middle of taking this step rather than this being the next step. In Joe Finn's book, in fact, Rights Come to Mind, and one of the people he interviewed talked about a floor, a hospital floor, where they not only had vegetative, so-called vegetative patients, but they also had patients with later stage dementia. So this guy essentially said there was a floor where they basically dumped people that had no very, what did he say? Something like not a very good chance of being alive. This is a layperson's kind of view of this. Um, and as we've learned more and more about this, we now know there was just a New York Times expose just a few weeks ago, which showed that these populations are given antipsychotic medication not because they have psychosis, but because they just want to keep them docile. So and again, it doesn't necessarily come from an evil place. It comes from a place of desperation, of not having enough resources to actually care for these patients. And so in some cases it's the best of, from their perspective, it's the best they can kind of offer. But they will literally diagnose them with psychoses they don't have, just in order to give them this medication to keep them docile until they die, essentially. So we already, and I can imagine, here's my biggest fear in all this. I can imagine a reasonable person coming in here and saying, guess what, this is horrible, and the solution is to offer these folks euthanasia or assisted suicide. That would be the more humane, dignified way to go here. And I mean, I don't need to tell you or anybody else that's even vaguely aware of the history of the 20th century and how disabled populations have been related to euthanasia in certain contexts. For us to just say, whoa, wait a minute here. But if we are going to stop that trend, we have to make a commitment to this population and say, whoa, this is if we consider people with advanced dementia our equals, then we have to fundamentally rethink how our care system works. We can no longer warehouse them in institutions that have nowhere close to the necessary resources to take care of them. We need to care for them in our homes if we can, which is going to take a lot, but I think we can work for. We got to recreate healthcare institutions to care for them in a particular way where they can't where that which are, in a way that's based on a culture of encounter and hospitality, not on a culture of discarding and throwing away. Um, and what I propose in the book actually is a short and medium and long term short, medium, and long term suggestions for this. So short term suggestions kind of falling on the individual and the family, maybe local communities and churches. Medium term, dialoguing with the surrounding culture, trying to get to the least common denominator, maybe working with disability rights groups and others to reverse this cultural trend. But failing that, the longer term suggestion, which is one, frankly, I hope we don't get to, but I worry we're going to need to, is the church herself is going to maybe have to step up here and totally revamp the way that it is in the world to care for the dozens of millions of people who are going to reach this stage over the next 2 decades, so that and I connect this to the past and how the church has responded to medical emergencies of the past, um, and suggest that if after say 10 years or so we're even worse than we were before, or if we haven't made any progress in reversing these trends, it might be up to the church and our allies, among Jews and Muslims who have very similar moral anthropology, to resist a broader culture that is hostile.
I was struck by your emphasis on the role that the church and as Christians need to play in this conversation, but also not just the conversation, really the addressing of these needs that are coming up. And I must say that uh, in a certain sense, I think that the long-term solution is also the most pressing one, meaning that there is a need for an evangelical witness that breaks through the mold of these very entrenched positions that are incapable of being moved much, it seems, by public debate. There seems to be really a need and an urgent longing for witnesses that show the inherent dignity of all people, no matter their conditions. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I'm very sympathetic, and this would not be the reason to do it. We should move to um, care for this population that bears the face of Christ in a special way because they bear the face of Christ. But it's also the fact that I don't need to say too much to imagine those of us or those who are watching this right now about the fact that the church has lost her credibility in many contexts across the United States and around the Western world, especially. Um, One of the ways, and again, the primary reason we should do this is because these populations bear the face of Christ. But also, if the church in fact did mobilize to care for this population and love this population, and the surrounding culture did not, this would also stand us in good stead with regard to our predecessors. There's some evidence, some historical evidence to show, in fact, that it was how the church responded to medical emergencies of the first few centuries of its existence, that took the church from a kind of marginalized place to a place where lots and lots of people wanted to join this group of people who loved one another and the most vulnerable, even when others fled the pandemics and other emergencies. Um, if we end up in a situation, which it looks like it's maybe more likely than not, where the culture is essentially fleeing um, uh, our duties to this vulnerable population, instead would slouch towards assisted suicide or marginalization just based on abandonment or something like that. If the church would in fact step up and meet this need and orient itself and reorient itself towards meeting the needs of these populations, I can see it really performing an essential evangelical role where people would look around and say, well, maybe there is something more going on here than the sex scandals. Maybe there is something more going on here than patriarchy. Maybe there is something more going on here um, than obsession with the pelvic issues or whatever the dismissive phrases that folks like to use. Maybe this is a group of people that really does care about the most vulnerable, that really does put those bearing the face of Christ as least among us first. Um, and maybe that could be, in fact, if that were done, I would think that would be a really powerful evangelical witness.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I really think that the book and the conversation we just had helps us name many of the pressing moral issues of our time. And accordingly, I wholeheartedly recommend all our viewers to pick up a copy of the book and read it. We'll have the link to the publisher's page down below. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you to all of you who have watched it. Please subscribe and turn your notifications on. We will start having these conversations regularly, and we love for you to join us. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.